A law enforcement agency, in North American English, is a government agency responsible for the enforcement of the laws. Outside North America, such organizations are usually called police services. In North America, some of these services are called police, others are known as sheriff's offices, departments, while investigative police services in the United States are often called bureaus, for example the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Jurisdiction. Lees which have their ability to apply their powers restricted in some way are said to operate within a jurisdiction. Lees will have some form of geographic restriction on their ability to apply their powers. The Lee might be able to apply its powers within a country, for example the United States of America's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives within a division of a country, for example the Australian State Queensland Police, or across a collection of countries. For example international organizations such as Interpol, or the European Union's Europol. Lees which operate across a collection of countries tend to assist in law enforcement activities, rather than directly enforcing laws, by facilitating the sharing of information necessary for law enforcement between lees within those countries. For example, Europol has no executive powers. Sometimes a lee's jurisdiction is determined by the complexity or seriousness of the non-compliance with a law. Some countries determine the jurisdiction in these circumstances by means of policy and resource allocation between agencies. For example in Australia, the Australian Federal Police take on complex serious matters referred to it by an agency, and the agency will undertake its own investigations of less serious or complex matters by consensus, while other countries have laws which decide the jurisdiction. For example in the United States of America, some matters are required by law to be referred to other agencies if they are of a certain level of seriousness or complexity. For example, cross-state boundary kidnapping in the United States is escalated to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Differentiation of jurisdiction based on the seriousness and complexity of the non-compliance either by law or by policy and consensus can coexist in countries. A lee which has a wide range of powers but whose ability is restricted geographically, typically to an area which is only part of a country, is typically referred to as local police or territorial police. Other lees have a jurisdiction defined by the type of laws they enforce or assist in enforcing. For example, Interpol does not work with political, military, religious, or racial matters. A lee's jurisdiction usually also includes the governing bodies they support, and the lee itself. Organization and structure. Jurisdictionally, there can be an important difference between international lees and multinational lees. Even though both are often referred to as international, even in official documents, an international law enforcement agency has jurisdiction and/or operates in multiple countries and across state borders, for example Interpol. A multinational law enforcement agency will typically operate in only one country, or one division of a country, but is made up of personnel from several countries, for example the European Union Police Mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina. International lees are typically also multinational, for example Interpol, but multinational lees are not typically international. Within a country, the jurisdiction of law enforcement agencies can be organized and structured in a number of ways to provide law enforcement throughout the country. A law enforcement agency jurisdiction can be for the whole country or for a division or subdivision within the country. Within divisions of a country, lee jurisdiction for a division within a country can typically be at more than one level. For example at the division level, that is state, province, or territory level, and for example at the subdivision level, that is county, shire, or municipality or metropolitan area level. In Australia, for example, each state has its own lees. In the United States, for example, typically each state and county or city has its own lees. As a result, because both Australia and the United States are federations and have federal lees, Australia has two levels of law enforcement. In the United States has multiple levels of law enforcement: federal, tribal, state, county, city, town, village, special jurisdiction and others. Division into operations areas. Often a lee's jurisdiction will be geographically divided into operations areas for administrative and logistical efficiency reasons. An operations area is often called a command or an office, while the operations area of a lee is sometimes referred to as a jurisdiction. Any lee operations area usually still has legal jurisdiction in all geographic areas the lee operates. But by policy and consensus the operations area does not normally operate in other geographical operations areas of the lee. For example, the United Kingdom's Metropolitan Police is divided into 32 borough operational command units, based on the London boroughs, and the New York City Police Department is divided into 76 precincts. Sometimes the one legal jurisdiction is covered by more than one lee, again for administrative and logistical efficiency reasons, and/or arising from policy and/or historical reasons. For example, the area of jurisdiction of English and Welsh law is covered by a number of lees called constabularies, each of which has legal jurisdiction over the whole area covered by English and Welsh law, but they do not normally operate out of their areas without formal liaison between them. The primary difference between separate agencies and operational areas within the one legal jurisdiction is the degree of flexibility to move resources between versus within agencies. When multiple lees cover the one legal jurisdiction, each agency still typically organizes itself into operations areas. In the United States, within a state's legal jurisdiction, county and city police agencies do not have full legal jurisdictional flexibility throughout the state, and this has led in part to mergers of adjacent police agencies. Federal and national. When a lee's jurisdiction is for the whole country, it is usually one of two broad types, either federal or national. Federal responsibilities. When the country has a federal constitution, a whole-of-country lee is referred to as a federal law enforcement agency. The responsibilities of a federal lee vary from country to country. Federal lee responsibilities are typically countering fraud against the Federation, immigration and border control regarding people and goods, investigating currency counterfeiting, policing of airports and protection of designated national infrastructure, national security, and the protection of the country's head of state and of other designated very important persons. For example, the Protective Service of the Australian Federal Police, or the Protective Mission of the United States Secret Service, and the U.S. State Department's Diplomatic Security Service. A federal police agency is a federal lee which also has the typical police responsibilities of social order and public safety as well as federal law enforcement responsibilities. However, a federal police agency will not usually exercise its powers at a divisional level. Such exercising of powers is typically via specific arrangements between the federal and divisional governing bodies. Examples of federal law enforcement agencies are the Australian Federal Police, Central Bureau of Investigation, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Federal Protective Service, United States Park Police, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the State Security Service. A federated approach to the organization of a country does not necessarily indicate the nature of the organization of law enforcement agencies within the country. Some countries, for example, Austria and Belgium, have a relatively unified approach to law enforcement, but still have operationally separate units for federal law enforcement and divisional policing. The United States has a highly fractured approach to law enforcement agencies generally, and this is reflected in the country's federal law enforcement agencies. Relationship between federal and federated divisions in a federation. There will typically be separate lees with jurisdictions for each division within the federation. A federal lee will have primary responsibility for laws which affect the federation as whole, and which have been enacted by the governing body of the federation. Members of a federal lee may be given jurisdiction within a division of a federation for laws enacted by the governing bodies of the divisions, either by the relevant division within the federation, or by the federation's governing body. For example, the Australian Federal Police is a federal agency and has the legal power to enforce the laws enacted by any Australian state, but will generally only enforce state law if there is a federal aspect to investigate. Typically, federal lees have relatively narrow police responsibilities. The individual divisions within the federation usually establish their own police agencies to enforce laws within the division. However, in some countries federal agencies have jurisdiction in divisions of the federation. This typically happens when the division does not have its own independent status and is dependent on the federation. For example, the Australian Federal Police is the police agency with jurisdiction in Australia's dependent territories, Jervis Bay Territory, Cocos Islands, Antarctic Territory, and Christmas Island. Similarly, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police is a federal agency and is the police agency for Canada's three territories, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and Yukon. Note that this is a direct jurisdictional responsibility and is different from the situation when a governing body makes arrangements with another governing body's lee to provide law enforcement for its subjects. This latter type of arrangement is described under establishment and constitution of law enforcement agencies. Some federations escalate non-compliance with laws with divisional or federal laws which involve multiple divisions within the federation to a federal lee. The United States, for example, escalates kidnapping to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In Australia, states liaise directly with each other when non-compliance with laws crosses state boundaries. Some countries provide law enforcement on land and in buildings owned or controlled by the Federation by using a federal lee. For example, the United States' Department of Homeland Security is responsible for some aspects of federal property law enforcement. Other countries, for example Australia, provide law enforcement for federal property via federal lees and the lees for the division of the federation in which the property is located. Typically, lees working in different jurisdictions, which overlap in the type of law non-compliance, actively establish mechanisms for cooperation and even establish joint operations and joint task forces. Often, members of a lee working outside of their normal jurisdiction on joint operations or task force are sworn in as special members of the host jurisdiction. National responsibilities. A national law enforcement agency is a lee in a country which does not have divisions capable of making their own laws. A national lee will have the combined responsibilities that federal lees and divisional lees would have in a federated country. National lees are usually divided into operations areas. A national police agency is a national lee which also has the typical police responsibilities of social order and public safety as well as national law enforcement responsibilities. Examples of countries with national police agencies are Canada, New Zealand, Italy, France, Japan, Philippines, and Nicaragua. To help avoid confusion over jurisdictional responsibility, some federal lees explicitly advise that they are not a national law enforcement agency. For example, the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation does this. Types. Lees can be responsible for the enforcement of laws affecting the behavior of people or the general community. For example, the New York City Police Department, or the behavior of commercial organizations and corporations. For example, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, for the benefit of the country as a whole. For example, the United Kingdom's Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. Religious law enforcement. A li can be responsible for enforcing secular law and/or religious law, for example Sharia or halakha. The significant majority of lis around the world are secular. Their governing bodies separating religious matters from the governance of their subjects. Religious law enforcement agencies, for example Saudi Arabia's Mutaween, exist where full separation of government and religious doctrine has not occurred, and are generally referred to as police agencies, typically religious police, because their primary responsibility is for social order within their jurisdiction and the relevant social order being highly codified as laws. Internal affairs. Often, a li will have a specific internal unit to ensure that the li is complying with relevant laws. For example, the United States' Federal Bureau of Investigation's Office of Professional Responsibility. In some countries and/or divisions within countries, specialized and/or separate lis are established to ensure that other lis comply with laws. For example, the Australian state New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption. Li internal self-compliance units and external li compliance agencies coexist in many countries. Names given to li internal self-compliance units are typically internal affairs, internal investigations, professional standards. Police agencies. Many law enforcement agencies are police agencies that have a broad range of powers and responsibilities. A police agency, however, also often has a range of responsibilities not specifically related to law enforcement. These responsibilities relate to social order and public safety. While this understanding of policing, being more encompassing than just law enforcement, has grown with and is commonly understood by society, it is recognized formally by scholars and academics. A police agency jurisdiction for social order and public safety will normally be the same as its jurisdiction for law enforcement. Military law enforcement. Military organizations often have law enforcement units. These units within the military organization are generally referred to as federal law enforcement. This may refer to a section of the military solely responsible for policing the armed forces, or MOS in the armed forces with training exceeding 48 hours with any weapon system. For example, 11B, 31BX. A separate section of the armed forces responsible for policing in the armed forces and in the Ministry of Defense such as the Gendarmeria Wojskowa. A section of the military solely responsible for policing the civilian population. The preventative police of a Brazilian state. The exact usage and meaning of the terms military, military police, provost, and gendarme varies from country to country. Non-military law enforcement agencies are sometimes referred to as civilian police, but usually only in contexts where they need to be distinguished from military police. However, they may still possess a military structure and protocol. In most countries, the term law enforcement agency when used formally includes agencies other than only police agencies. The term law enforcement agency is often used in the United States of America to refer to police agencies. However, it also includes agencies with peace officer status or agencies which prosecute criminal acts. A county prosecutor or district attorney is considered to be the chief law enforcement officer of a county. Other responsibilities of lis are typically related to assisting subjects to avoid non-compliance with a law, assisting subjects to remain safe and secure, assisting subjects after a safety-impacting event. For example, policing social order, public incident mediation, preempting antisocial behavior, dangerous event, public logistics, public safety, general search and rescue, crowd control, regulation, services and facilities, disaster victim identification, education and awareness campaigns, victim prevention and avoidance, law compliance, public safety. Many lis have administrative in-service responsibilities, often as their major responsibility, as well as their law enforcement responsibilities. This is typical of agencies such as customs or taxation agencies, which provide services and facilities to allow subjects to comply with relevant laws as their primary responsibilities. Private law enforcement. Private police are law enforcement bodies that are owned and/or controlled by non-governmental entities. Private police are often utilized in places where public law enforcement is seen as being underprovided. For example, the San Francisco Patrol Special Police, which still exists today. It is argued that private law enforcement may serve as a superior alternative to a government monopoly law enforcement regulation. Many LEs are also involved in the monitoring and/or application of regulations and codes of practice. See for example Australian Commercial Television Code of Practice, Building Code, Code Enforcement. Monitoring of the application of regulations and codes of practice is not normally considered law enforcement. However, the consistent non-compliance by a subject with regulations or codes of practice may result in the revocation of a license for the subject to operate. And operating without a license is typically illegal. Also, the failure to apply codes of practice can impact other subjects' safety and life, which can also be illegal.